Greetings. Hi, it's John Reynolds and Peter Lower from Expert Pensions Consulting, and we are in conversation, I think, Peter, about what I think we're going to call, or I'm going to call, 23-24 going forward. But it has another title, Addressing Firms' Capital Adequacy, or proposals from the FCA in addressing capital adequacy amongst retail investment firms or firms that give investment advice, which includes investments and pensions. Thoughts on that?
I think someone in the FCA, John, must have a sense of humour because the headlines last week was that polluter pays, and obviously that coincided with the COP28 conference out in Dubai, and the whole essence of 23-24 as an overview is that the intention is that the FCA want firms to more proactively look at their clients and where redress or where harm has been identified to address those.
Yeah, both on a current and prospective basis. So what the FCA I think are saying is that there has been a huge amount of redress payable from the Financial Services Compensation Scheme from a relatively limited small pool of players.
Yes.
And they're suggesting that under the proposals that the scope or the ability for firms to write advice should also then be underpinned by having proper amounts of capital adequacy to enable them to write that advice and be in a position to pay any compensation going forward if it's necessary to the clients.
Yes, and the consultation runs until March next year, and the intention is to bring into being, and they've already published at the back of the consultation paper, the proposed rules in H1 2025.
Yep.
I think one or two things that we may want to have a chat about would be, first thing I noticed that came out of the document was the fact that the FCA have categorically stated that they will not look unfavourably upon firms from a wrongdoing point of view. I think they refer to it as, John.
Yep.
Where firms proactively look at their clients and identify whether or not issues have occurred where advisors may have given incorrect advice or where there is an alignment with the correct attitude to risk or whatever it might be.
Yeah, and I'm going to, and that's a great point. I think the FCA are saying, there are ways in which you can tackle this going forward. In whichever way you tackle it, we're not going to be jumping all over you if you have identified that you've got a significant number of cases that you want to set aside some capital to address any potential future redress.
Yeah.
That to me is, I quite understand it. I actually do, and for the purposes of putting this on the record, I actually do understand where the FCA is coming from. I'm a supporter of the FCA and what it's trying to do. It's trying to make the market safer by ensuring that firms who are giving advice have got the necessary financial underpin in their business. But I think more importantly, Peter, they've got the processes to ensure that those redress, those mistakes are limited. They don't want too many redress claims. So there's more encouragement to have proper processes, proper engagement with the client, doing the financial planning properly so that they don't pay out redress. But the FCA are saying, great, we want you to do that. Under consumer duty, you have responsibility to do that. And if you're taking this opportunity to clean up your business, we're not going to stop you from doing that. We're not going to discourage you from doing that.
And the interesting part here comes along, John, and I know we've only just scanned through the document to start with, but where do the PI companies fit into this?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting one. So I'm going to say a couple of things quite regularly. One is going back to the previous question about not impacting the overall business by declaring that they've some potential unsuitability or future redress. Very similar to BSPS2, or BSPS, sorry, BSPS, where they were asking firms to be proactive on those cases, and it didn't result in then a domino effect, or hasn't resulted in a domino effect for those businesses. Those clients were taken care of. Now in the BSPS, a lot of the PAI companies ran away from it, and a lot of firms didn't have PI for cases that were under British Steel. So going forward, I think for me, it's a really interesting one in the DB market, in the DB space. So looking at the consultation paper, there are a number of ways of looking at it. You could potentially, let's say, I have my back book reviewed, and I've identified from within that back book there is potential cases that could be declared unsuitable. Where does my PI policy come in at that point, when I am almost self-declaring? Because remember, the FCA is not instructing me to do that under, for example, a Section 166. The FCA is not instructing a Client Contact Act exercise commonly known as a Section 166. This is taking personal responsibility for each firm.
And I think you're right, the personal responsibility, they also refer to the fact that this is just an extension of the consumer duty.
Well, it's an extension. I think it's an addition. But you're right, it's an extension or an addition. But under the remit of consumer duty, they're saying that you should be proactively,
correct.
I think they use
yeah,
that
absolutely,
word,
yeah.
proactively assessing your book. So going back to your PI question, and we will be responding to 23-24.
Yeah.
One of the questions I would like to ask our PI before we respond to the consultation is, how does this work with our current PI policy?
Yeah, I suppose, what are the boundaries? What are you able to do without stepping over that mark, which would invalidate?
Great question.
I assume. The other interesting aspect is that they differentiate between where you've had historic FOS complaints, or that you're aware of complaints, and seem to suggest that that is a yardstick as to measure potentially whether or not more cases could emerge from the back book based upon what the historic position with FOS has been.
Yeah, well, I think this is another interesting one. For some firms, you've got the potential for systemic risk in the business. That potential systemic risk in the business may well be reflected through from the FOS. So you've got systemic problems that are being demonstrated through customer complaints, which go to the FOS, which are being paying out. So although they've said that there is a probability basis in which they would like firms to use, 28% I think is the number. I think there's two things that we could potentially look at here. You've got firms who, and I think they use one of these as an example, 40% complaints in a book of business that they're particularly looking at. So they've identified systemic risk. They've identified that within that book, there's a 40% chance of a complaint being made on a historical basis. Does that mean then they project forward at 40% on the book, on the prospective book? Well, that's an interesting one. But I think there's another question as well about companies, firms that have zero complaints.
Yes. Yeah.
So you've got one end and you've got, so let's say 40% is at the top end, based on historical data of a systemic nature, versus firms who've got zero complaints. Do they still have to align 28%? Because that's what the papers say.
Yes, and it'll be very interesting to see what the reaction is from the IFA fraternity in terms of how they will respond to the consultation paper. What action will they actually take? Because obviously, the interesting part is that they refer to two types of liability: ongoing liability in terms of complaints that haven't been resolved, and in addition, a perspective where you believe that potentially there may be a complaint in the future. But they also highlight how that complaint can cease to exist with either you calculating redress or a remediation of some sort. And one of the examples they give as a remediation is that you put the client into a position that they should have been and pay for that putting into the position. So what could that mean? Does that mean that a switch into a personal pension wasn't appropriate, or a SIP invest, or what? It's very interesting to see how that will develop.
It is, and I'll throw another one into the mix. Let's say you get an external consultant to review every one of your cases pre-advice. So you've got pre-advice reviews. And if those pre-advice reviews, which are done independently, are not showing up a systemic risk, does that mean that they're not included because they've been assessed pre-advice, they've been assessed for suitability pre-advice, and if you've got external confirmation at the point of advice that it's okay, externally, independently, does that give it a tick in the box as having...
Well, the other interesting thing you bring up, the word suitability isn't mentioned in it. It's an assessment of, I don't quite understand, but the point you made earlier in our conversation is the fact that it's not only DB work, but it highlights investment work as well. So what happens for switches, or as we were chatting away this morning, John, what happens where an IFA wants to move practices or move firms and they want to take a book of business with them? What happens to those clients coming into that new firm? Does that firm have to carry out an annual review instigated immediately? Because within the consultation paper, they refer, or they give an example of a firm at an annual review stage saying, oh, hang on, I think we may have a problem here, and identifying that as an issue.
Yeah. I'm going to throw another point into the mix as well. In terms of DB calculations. So we all know we all know what happened in BSPS, and the FCA provided a calculator. And I think, as we said last night, the calculator was provided for purposes of cost. Yeah, it saved the cost because they saved the clients the cost, saved the IFAs the cost, but also in terms of clarity and consistency. There was a clear methodology and it was consistently used across the whole piece. Now, although we've got guidance on redress, you and I both know that there was, even within the guidance on redress, there was still a lot of scope from which way you could tackle the redress within BSPS. And even within the FCA calculator, there are various ways in which you could look at a case and look at different things. So my question would be, and I think I posed this to you last night, but if I've got a book of 200 cases and I'm going to have to annually assess them for potential redress, how am I going to do that cost effectively without making myself bust?
Well, the point that is in the consultation paper, which needs expanding out or greater detail, would be the fact that where a prospective liability ceases. So in other words, what it says is that you deem that no redress is due or that no remediation is due, and that you write to the consumer, the client, and that they accept that. It's very interesting.
It is. And I'm going to stop there. I think we've highlighted already that there is a series of questions which, and I think the FCA has recognised this, that the FCA are saying the consultation period is a little bit longer than normal.
16 weeks.
16 weeks, and then they're going to pause and reflect on that for the second half of 2024. And then the rules are coming in early 25. So we're going to have a few questions, Peter, to ask the FCA. There's going to be a few implications of firms, and certainly if there's anybody out there watching this that would like to engage in a conversation with us, drop us a line.